Hashem, today's daf yomi is Menachos daf Ayin Beis, Menachos 72. We're going to start on the second line on 72a, on the second line from the top. It says about the Omer, even though there's a prohibition against cutting the Omer, Kotrim and Theos, that you're allowed to cut down the Omer on account of the saplings. You may base on Avel, because if there's a mourner and they need a place to stand, we may base on Midrash and account of Torah study. So, meaning, say, if we need a place to give the shear. So, my time, what's the reason why this is allowed? As the Gemara, Kitzirchem Amarachmana. Torah says your harvesting is what's prohibited. The low Kitzir mitzvah, but not if it's for a mitzvah. So the saplings also have to assume that maybe there's kolayim there, and you're getting rid of the kolayim, and so therefore that's also a mitzvah. So you're not allowed to tie up the bundles, but you can leave them there untied. So my timer, why is it allowed? The common because we just want to make sure, as much as possible, we don't allow you to do the violation and do the extra work, and so therefore, since you can accomplish your goals without tying it up, that's what we make you do. And then it says, mitzvah omer lahavi minakama. The mitzvah of the omer is to bring from the grain that's standing. So Tanar Rabbanan, the Brisa says, there's a pasuk. The pasuk says, in takriv minchas bikurim. Pasuk says, if you bring, this is in last week's parasha, if you bring the mincha of the bikurim la Hashem. So what do we learn from this pasuk? It's ambiguous. What matam omer? What's the pasuk going to teach us? So fisha mitzvah omer lahavi minakama. It's because ideally you're supposed to bring it from the standing grain. How do I know if you don't put any standing grain? You could bring it from the grain that's already cut. A second explanation. It says you shall bring because it's ideally it's a mitzvah to bring from the moist. As we saw several times, Carmel, Rachum, Alal. So how do I know if you don't find any moist grain? You should bring from the dry. So it says the verse takriv. Davar acher, a third approach. Takriv, you should bring a fisha mitzvah so it's ideally, you're supposed to cut it at night. How do I know if you cut it during the day, it's also kosher? Takriv. It says in the pasuk, so vidoches Shabbos. So the Gerasa issues here also. How do you know that if you bring it during the day, it's kosher, and it also overrides the Shabbos? The Hamomer takriv. Takriv kol shehu. So the Brisa summarizes the takriv. You could bring it even if it's cut. Takriv mikom makom. You bring it regardless, meaning to say even if it's dry. And takriv afil b'Shabbos. Takriv afil b'tumah. You bring it even on Shabbos, and you bring it even in a state of ritual impurity, because we say Tumah dochas at tzibor. Tumah overrides in the case of the communal Tumah sotra b'tzibor. In the case of communal requirement, you can bring it in Tumah. Nitzar bayom kosher. If you harvested it during the day, it's kosher, even though the mitzvah is ideally at night. The Gemara says, but there's a contradictory in Mishnah Megillah. The Mishnah Megillah says, "Vatanan kol ayla kosher ktziras omer v'akter chalavim v'avarim." The entire night is kosher for the harvesting of the omer and to bring the fats and the limbs on the altar. Zaklal. So it says the Mishnah. Davar shemitzvah so b'layla kosher kol layla. Anything which is the main mitzvah at night is kosher the entire night. So kosher kol hayom, kosher kol. Davar shemitzvah so kol hayom, kosher kol hayom. Davar shemitzvah so layla, kosher kol layla. Anything which a mitzvah is during the day, which is most mitzvahs, but Rashi gives us examples like the slaughtering, the sprinkling of the blood. Then the mitzvah is during the day. Anything which a mitzvah is at night, then the mitzvah is at night. Katani laila dumya diyom. Though it says the night similar to the day. Ma diyom b'laila. Just like if the mitzvah is during the day, you can't do it at night. After laila b'yom namilo. Also, if the mitzvah is at night, you shouldn't be allowed to do it during the day. So our Mishnah says that the Omer is kosher during the day, where if you did it during the day, whereas, excuse me, the Mishnah Megillah implies that the Omer is not kosher if you do it during the day. It's only kosher at night. So how do we answer this contradiction between the two anonymous Mishnayos? So Marabba, the two separate opinions. Okasha ha Rabbi Bahar Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Shimon. So one Mishnah is the position of Rabbi, and one is the position of Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Shimon. How so? The Tanya, we're going to the Brisa. Let's say a person was standing to bring the Omer, vinitmes, and then the Omer became tamei. If you could go out and cut some more, Omer lo haveacheres tachteah. You bring another. You would say, go bring more Omer. But if there's nothing else to cut, Omer lo haveacheres v'shotok. You say, be quiet and don't spread the news that we're relying on the b'di'evet, the ex post facto situation of cutting it in a state of tumah. This is the position of Rebbe. He says you're allowed to cut even during the day. That's also in accordance with our Mishnah. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer bar Rabbi Shimon says ben kach or ben kach. Whereas Rabbi Shimon says no, either way. Omer lo have'tikach v'shasok. You tell him to cut it and be quiet about it. You tell him to offer the Omer in a state of tumah and be quiet about it because you can't cut during the day. So possible because Rabbi Eliezer bar Rabbi Shimon says anything that is harvested not properly is disqualified. And the mitzvah of Katsira is at night and not during the day. So therefore, that which it says, Niktzir b'yom is kosher, that's the position of Rebbe. And the Mishnah in the Megillah, which says that it's disqualified if you do it during the night, that it's disqualified if you do it during the day, that's the position of Rebbe Eliezer bar Rabbi Shimon. So the Gemara says, hold on one second. So the Gemara says, so again, Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Shimon saying it's disqualified if you do it during the day. So Amar Rabba. So now the Gemara says Rabbi Bar Chana. Now Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Shimon says it's disqualified if you do it during the day. Mashitas Rabbi Akiva Rabbo Shal Aviv Amar. He follows the position of Rabbi Akiva, the Rebbe of his father. This is Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Shimon. This is I follow the position of Rabbi Akiva, and we'll see it's also Rabbi Akiva with Rabbi Yishmael. The Tanam, because we're going to the Mishnah, Barak Rabbi Eliezer Demila, in Mesechah Shabbos, Kral Amar Rabbi Akiva, that Rabbi Akiva's position, his general rule was, Kol Malacha She'avshar Lo La'asoto Me'erev Shabbos, any work for the bris milah, we know a bris milah itself overrides Shabbos. Rabbi Akiva's position is any malacha, any violation of Shabbos that you could have done before Shabbos, ain't a dochas Shabbos. You're no longer allowed to do this on Shabbos. So therefore, Rabbi Eliezer bar Shimon follows the position of Rabbi Akiva that if something could be done before Shabbos, you can't violate the Shabbos. This silver like Rabbi Shmuel, and he holds like Rabbi Shmuel, who says Ketziras Omer mitzvah, and he also holds like Rabbi Shmuel, who says that the harvesting of the Omer is a mitzvah and overrides the Shabbos. It's not Rabbi Shmuel Omer macharish rishus avkatzi rishus. That Rabbi Shmuel says just like plowing is discretionary and discretionary plowing is not allowed. Also, harvesting that's discretionary is not allowed. Yotze katsira Omer shehim mitzvah, but the katsira Omer is an actual mitzvah, and so therefore it overrides the Shabbos. And if it's possible, if you would be in a position Niktar Shalom mitzvah, so kosher that you could harvest it during the day, and it would be kosher. Amai dachi Shabbos. Why would it override the Shabbos? Niktara me'erev Shabbos. You could harvest it on the eve of Shabbos, and then you don't have to worry about cutting it on Friday night. Just cut it right beforehand. Look at Rashi. Svirulon Rabbi Akiva. He holds like Rabbi Akiva. That anything that you're possible to do on Erev Shabbos does not override the Shabbos. So we see from the fact that it overrides the Shabbos, we see from here that if you would have cut it at the wrong time, it would be disqualified. And so therefore the only time to do the mitzvah is on Motzei Yom Tov, which is at night. And therefore it overrides the Shabbos. So we see from here, that's proof that Rabbi Eliezer bar Shimon says you can't do it during the day. I mean, really, why can't you say he would have cut it the night before? Hold on one second. Let me just see if they raise that question. Let's see if they raise it. Vav. Okay, they don't. Okay, so anyway, so the Gemara says, back to the case here. Mididachi Shabbos, from the fact that Rabbi Shmuel says it overrides Shabbos, and we see from here, Shema Minan, Niktar Shalok Mitzvah, so we see from here that if it will be cut not at the right time, it would be possible, it would be disqualified. So the Gemara says, the Rebbe Lav. Hold on one second. So the Gemara says, the Rebbe Rav Talmidei the Rebbe Shimon, but also Rebbe, who says they're allowed to car during the day, he also was a student of Rebbe Shimon. And so if that's the case, he also should have said, you can do it during the day. How do we know that Rebbe was a student of Rebbe Shimon? Because Rebbe says, made in Torah or Shimon b'Tekoa. When we used to study with Rebbe Shimon in Tekoa, Hayinu Malin lo Shemin, on Shabbos they had to carry it by a private domain. So we would bring the oil and the towel from the courtyard to the roof, migago karpif, and the roof to the yard, mikarpif, karpif acher, achan magin l'mayan. We would go through all these back way private domains until we came to the spring, Shana Rochotzimbo. We see, but the proof of that price is that Rebbe was a student of Rebbe Shimon. So if that's the case, Rebbe should also not allow the Omer to be brought during the day. Then why does he allow it be brought during the day? Savarlah ki'idach to Rebbe Shimon. Rebbe holds like the other position of Rebbe Shimon. The Tanya Amar Rebbe Shimon Borei Kama Chaviva Mitzvah B'Shaita. So he says Rebbe's of the position that Rebbe Shimon says, come and see how precious it is to do a mitzvah in the proper time. Shari Hector, Chalavim Navarim, that the fats, that the burning of the fats and the limbs are ksherim kol laila. They're kosher if you do it all night long. And so therefore, if the carbon tummy was burned on Shabbos or the musaf, you would say, okay, maybe just wait till after Shabbos and burn it. And you don't have to wait until it gets dark. And they would bring it on Shabbos. So we see from here, even though you could fulfill the mitzvah without desecrating Shabbos, nevertheless, it's better to do it on Shabbos because that's the most precious time to do the mitzvah. And so we see from here the rabbis have the position also with respect to the harvesting of the Omer, and even though you could cut it before Shabbos, nevertheless, it's better to fulfill the mitzvah on the night of the 16th. But even though you're going to need to violate the Shabbos. The Gemara says on top of 72a, Rebbe Lezer Shimon lo shmi'alei. Does Rebbe Lezer Shimon, didn't he hear this law from his father of Chaviva mitzvah b'shaita, that it's so precious to do the mitzvah in the proper time? And so therefore, how does he know? How could he prove that the cutting of the Omer violates the Shabbos? So the Gemara says, no, that Rebbe Lezer Shimon says, don't bring me a proof from that, because he would say, Shani Hasam Sharei Dachta Shchita Shabbos. That case is different because we've already violated the Shabbos by the carbon Omer on top of 72b, because we've already done the Shchita, so we've already violated the Shabbos with the slaughtering. And so therefore we could continue to violate it. Well, Rabbi Achinami Dachta Shchita Shabbos. So what would Rabbi say about that? It also proves that the Shchita, we've already violated the Shabbos with the Shlita. So why? So how can you prove that this has this case of Chaviva Mitzvah B'Shaita? El Kasava Rebbe Ktiris Omer Lo Dachya Shabbos. So it must be that Rebbe's of the position that the reason why you cannot cut it during the day is because he says that Tzviris Omer does not override, that the Ktziris Omer does not override the Shabbos. That must be Rebbe's position. We'll read the Rashi here. Rashi says, Ela Bal Karchach Shmiya V'lo Gamar Minei. it must be that Rebbe has heard this, but he didn't learn from it. Because we would say the Hasim Gabi Avarim, excuse me, that's the previous case. So must be that by the limbs, Gabi Avarim, Shani the Dachal Shabbos. Rebbe Elazar Shimon would say that there's a reason why it doesn't override Shabbos. Bishum Chavivus Mitzvah. The reason why the limbs override Shabbos because of the preciousness of the mitzvah. Sharei, where it's not because of the precious, or not only because of the preciousness of the mitzvah, but rather because Shlita has already overridden the Shabbos before the limbs were burned, because he couldn't have done an Erev Shabbos. Even the Nita and Shabbos L'tchos Eitzel Shlita. And so since Shabbos was pushed off by Shlita, Nidchanami Eitzel Torah is also pushed off by the burning of the fat. Avo Ba'omer, Leiko Meimer Hachi. But by the Omer, you can't say that the B'Shas Katsira, because at the moment of the harvest, Akati Lo Itchei Shabbos, Shabbos was not pushed off yet. And even though the next day you're going to push off the bringing of the Omer during the time of the harvest, meaning that even though when you bring the Omer, it's going to be pushed off, nevertheless, during the time of the harvesting was not yet pushed off. And if it were not for the fact that it was not possible to do it on the eve of Shabbos, Shabbos, it would not override the Shabbos, Mishum Chavivus Mitzvah. And also, Rebbe, also you could say. So anyway, so that's the question back on Rebbe. So Gemara says it must be that Rebbe's of the position, because of Rebbe Ketziras Omer lo Dachya Shabbos. Rebbe must be in the position that the Omer does not override the Shabbos. You can't harvest the Omer on Shabbos, and so therefore, because you could cut it the day before Shabbos. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, does Rebbe really not say that the Omer overrides Shabbos? But we learned in the previous Mishnah that both on Shabbos and during the week, that you have to, even on Shabbos, everybody agrees that at least you bring the Omer. The Gemara says the local Rebbe. Rebbe would argue with that. But Shalosh kupos of shalosh mangos. Another Mishnah that even on Shabbos, you put in 3 baskets, 3 sickles. The local Rebbe, not like Rebbe. That's with Shabbos. Yamalam Shabbos Zu. Again on Shabbos, we have the proclaimer says, even should I cut it even on Shabbos? Again, the local Rebbe. So, and then another attempt. It says Nikter b'yom kosher v'dochas Shabbos. If you harvest it during the day, it's kosher and override the Shabbos. So again. Man Shabbos Leidavar Nikter b'yom kosher. That's Rebbe. B'kataning dochas the Shabbos, and he says it overrides the Shabbos. The Gemara says, "My love, doesn't that mean that the harvesting overrides the Shabbos?" Kitzira. No. When Rebbe says that it overrides the Shabbos, he's not referring to the harvesting. He's referring of the Omer. He's referring to the akrava, to the bringing of it. Avol Kitzira lo. You mean to say that you can't do the cutting of the Omer on Shabbos? But Tanya Rebbe Omer. It says in the Brisa that Rebbe taught Vayidaber Moshe Moedei Hashem. It says Moshe spoke about the festivals of God. Ma'atam Alomar. Why does it need to say that? Didn't it already say? It already says in the pasuk all of the Moedos. So why do we need to say Vayidaber Moshe Moedei Hashem? So we only know that the Talmud and the Pesach override the Shabbos and Emer Ben b'Moedo. B'Moedo v'afsilu b'Shabbos. B'Moedo v'afsilu b'Tumah. That we only know about the Pesach and the Talmud that they override the Shabbos and Tumah. Shar Karbanos Hatzibur Minayin. And we know that the other communal offerings override the Shabbos. Hamomer Eila Ta'asu Hashem B'Moadechem. So that they override the Shabbos. I mean, Nail Rabbas Omer V'Karei Vimo. How do I know that the Omer and what's brought with it, and the shtei alechem, and the 2 loaves of bread, and whatever's brought with it, how do I know that they override the Shabbos? The Torah establishes a festival for all of the festivals. Now, for what is it establishing a festival? If you want to say for the if you want to say it's to be brought as a korban, it can't be, because the 2 loaves of bread are never going up on the altar; they're just waved. Elapshita, it's teaching us that what overrides Shabbos, the Tchina, Varkada, by the Shtei Lechem, what's overriding Shabbos is the grinding and the sifting. Ude Kavasa, Gabe Omer, Litzira. And in the parallel case, by the Omer, what's overriding Shabbos is the harvesting, because Dachi, it's a Shabbos, and it overrides the Shabbos. So we see from here that the Omer does override the Shabbos. And so you can't say that this isn't a position of Rebbe, because it says Rebbe Omer. So the Gemara says, no. Omer la krava u'shtei lechem lafia. Rabbi would say the 2 loaves of bread is for the baking, and the Omer is for the bringing of the altar. So therefore, there are activities that this bread says that the pasuk means when it says that the Omer overrides the Shabbat. The Gemara says because Sava Rebbe Tanur Mekadesh. But how can Rebbe say? How could Rebbe say? Rebbe's of the position that the oven itself sanctifies it, and therefore, meaning to say, the reason why the baking overrides the Shabbos is because Rebbe's of the position that you need to bake on Shabbos, because Rebbe says that the oven is what sanctifies the bread, and he afilach me'et mo'av salabulina, and if you would bake it the day before, it becomes disqualified because it's already sanctified. And so therefore, that's the reason why Rebbe says that the oven overrides the Shabbos. So the Gemara says, V'sava Rabbi Tanur Mekadesh, does Rebbe really have this position that the oven is what sanctifies the bread? But Tanya, Kivsei Atzeres, Ein Mekachin Esalechem El B'Shlita. We learn about the sheep of Shavuos, that they are Mekadesh the bread when they're slaughtered, not when the bread is baked. Keitzat Shachto Lashman Zark Damo Lashman Kidesh Alechem. If you slaughtered it with the right intent or sprinkled the blood with the right intent, and this takes us back already. Now we go back to Daf Mem Zayin Amanav. Remember, we did this a month ago. That if you did the bread, if you slaughtered the sheep with the right intent, it sanctifies the bread. But if you did it with the wrong intent, Shachtan Shalosh Man Zarktam Shalosh Man Lo Kiddush Alechem. And then we said, because we're on this tangent now, Shachtan Lishman Vizark Daman Shalosh. Once you slaughter it with the right intent, you sprinkled the blood with the wrong intent, or then Halacham Kaddish Ve'ino Kaddish. And if Divrei Rebbe. So Rebbe says it's Kaddish Ve'ino Kaddish. Remember, we learned back there in 47a that there's a dispute. What does it mean Kaddish Ve'ino Kaddish? The Marayim argue, what does he mean? Does it mean you can't eat it? Does it mean it's so that was one position there. Another position was Abaye says that you can't redeem them, and it has to do with the redemption of them. Rava says that means you can't eat them. But anyway, the Gemara says, Rabbi Lezer Bar Shimon says, "All meino kodesh acha yishcho ushman v'izrok daman ushman." They're only kodesh once you slaughter them ushman and sprinkle their blood ushman. But anyway, we see from here that Rabbi is saying that the sheep is what sanctifies the bread, not the baking in the oven. So if that's the case, why wouldn't Rebbe allow you to bake it the day before? So I'm Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, hukfu v'lo hukfu kamar. No, it's talking about the idea of once the sheep are slaughtered, then it was attached, the bread was attached to those sheep, and they can't be switched. Look at Rashi. That's when the chalos, the loaves of bread, are attached to that sheep. You can't switch the bread to a different carbon. So he's saying they're really being mekadesh in the oven, but this is about whether or not it's attached to those sheep. This was the discussion in the Talmud of the bringing of the Omer, which we have to know, God willing, because in around 1 week from today, a little bit more than a week, we're going to be starting counting the Omer. So says the next Mishnah, we'll just start the Mishnah. Menachos, Nikmatzos, V'Shireyan, L'Kohanim. These are the Menachos that the Kmitza takes place on them, and the remnants of them goes to the Kohanim, meaning the Kohanim eat the Shirayim. Minchas HaSoas, V'Machavas, V'Marchashes, V'Achaos, V'Arakikit. So the Soas is the flour and oil before it's baked. The Machavas is the flat pan. The Marchashes is the deep pan. We saw different machokas about this. Chaos, the Rakikin are the two different loaves that are baked. the mincha of the idolaters, the mincha of the nashim, the mincha of the omer, the mincha of the sinner, chote, minchas kenos. All these, the kmitza is burnt. Yeah, you have to go to 3, but we're stopping just a moment. 3 is down there. It's all the way. No, it's all the way at the end. But we're gonna stop in 1 minute anyway. Minchas chote shel kohanim nikmetzet. Rabbi Shimon says the mincha of the sinner of the kohanim, the kmitza, right there in front of you. 1 shelf out. Mincha of the sinner of the kohanim, the kmitza takes place. The kometz karva atzma mishirayim craving watzma. So Rabbi Shimon has the position that the mincha of the sinner of the kohanim, it does have a kamitza, even though it's all entirely burned, but you do the kamitza and you burn the kamitza, and then you burn the shirayim. So even though they're both burned, even though everything's burned, he still says that you burn, that you take a kamitza and burn it. And now we'll start just the Gemara because we already had this tradition twice. This statement to Rav Papa has already appeared twice, and it's the 3rd time. We still don't know what it means really. There's a dispute about it amongst the Rishonim. It says Rav Papa, Kol Hecha de Tanan, Eser Tanan. Whenever the Mishnah lists 10. So there's two, Rashi had 2 opinions about this. One is, the one that's easier for me to understand, is the idea that you have to bring the 10 loaves of bread. Whenever you bring a mincha offering, you bring 10, either 10 chalas or 10 rakikin. You can't bring half. And my kamash, Rabbi Shimon is teaching us now, Rabbi Shimon, who says, mechta chalas and mechta rakikin yavi. He says that you could bring, when you bring the mincha, you could bring half chalas and half rakikin. You could split it, mix and match. Mashmon doel. So we don't say that. Okay, so we'll stop here. This is today's Daf Yomi Baruch Hashem, and we'll pick it up afterwards.
Thank you.
Great.